Before we begin, viewer discretion is advised. This material is intended for entertainment. What happens when a conservative commentator known for challenging progressive narratives, someone whose career is built on refusing to accept confident but unsupported claims, comes across what she considers the most intellectually dishonest panel in daytime TV, when a person who has spent years deconstructing weak arguments through methodical logic confronts hosts who've operated for so long inside an echo chamber that their talking points have rarely faced serious scrutiny. When a debate about one of America's most divisive topics becomes an exercise in exposing contradictions so stark that even loyal viewers may start to feel uneasy. What you're about to see isn't just another political exchange full of people shouting past one another. It isn't just another partisan shouting match where loudness replaces substance, nor another culture war clash where everyone walks away even more entrenched. This moment captures Candace Owens methodically taking apart the View's abortion arguments with precise criticism, revealing what she viewed as long-standing contradictions in their reasoning she believed had gone unaddressed because acknowledging them would be politically inconvenient. She highlighted inconsistencies she felt should have been obvious, showing the difference between arguments that merely sound persuasive and those that actually hold up. This is Whoopi Goldberg. Enjoy Beher realizing that not every commentator will sit quietly while their talking points go unchallenged, that not every conservative will accept being dismissed as a religious extremist without responding with facts and reasoning, that not every voice in the abortion debate will allow emotional claims that collapse under scrutiny to dominate the conversation. This is what happens when someone demands coherence rather than emotional satisfaction. Owens didn't physically walk onto the View set that day. It was a counterpoint segment where she responded to clips from the show, but she approached their arguments with the same energy she would have brought to a face-to-face debate. She anticipated exactly what she would get from the panel. Hosts who had spent years advocating for abortion rights without real pushback from within their own circle. Arguments built on emotion rather than careful logic, because that's what their audience preferred. A level of comfort and ideological agreement that had made internal consistency optional. What they received instead, and what their audience witnessed, was someone willing to dissect each claim, point out contradictions with evidence, and refuse to let weak reasoning stand simply because it was delivered with moral certainty and the confidence that comes from rarely being challenged. This isn't about taking sides on abortion. It's about intellectual honesty, logical consistency, and what unfolds when someone finally says, "Your arguments don't hold up, and here's why." Using the host's own statements and contradictions as the basis, Behar assumed she could make broad claims about sex, culture, and responsibility without anyone questioning the assumptions behind them, assumptions that, when examined, revealed more about progressive norms than conservative ones. Whoopi Goldberg assumed she could cite biological facts when convenient for abortion arguments, while dismissing those same facts in discussions about transgender issues, never expecting someone to point out that holding both positions simultaneously creates a contradiction. They soon found that Candace Owens operates differently. Emotional appeals don't replace logic. Contradictions aren't ignored, and feeling righteous doesn't excuse making arguments that fail under examination. The security of an echo chamber offers no protection when someone insists on evaluating claims clearly and publicly. Prepare yourself, because what follows isn't just another political disagreement. It's a demonstration of how to challenge widely repeated assumptions that have been accepted as unquestionable truth, how to expose arguments that have survived only because they haven't been tested, and how to refuse to let poor logic slide simply because it's delivered confidently to an approving audience. That morning, the View studio carried its usual air of certain moral authority as Joy Behar and Whoopi Goldberg recorded the segment that Owens later responded to. A recent Supreme Court case had given them new material, another chance to voice outrage and frame themselves as defenders of women's rights against what they repeatedly described as ignorant religious extremism that supposedly misunderstood basic biology. Behar opened the segment with the certainty of someone convinced she was stating the obvious to Audience primed to agree. Her tone half exasperation, half condescension surfaced whenever she felt the correct position was so clear that disagreement could only reflect ignorance or bad faith. She began with what sounded like a prepared monologue. "It's a very interesting schism that goes on here," she said. "On the one hand, sex sells everywhere. You can't watch even an aspirin commercial without someone having sex. Turn on any streaming show and there's soft porn everywhere." She paused, letting the setup land, then delivered what she seemed to view as a powerful critique of conservative hypocrisy. "They encourage all of that. Sex sells. And yet, when it comes to the reality of pregnancy, this particular group on the right, these religious zealots, don't understand what actually happens when you have sex." The audience murmured their approval right on cue, nodding along with a narrative they'd heard countless times. That conservatives supposedly lacked basic biological understanding, that religious people lived in denial about sex, and that the right's position on abortion came from not grasping how pregnancy works. It was a comfortable storyline, one that let Joy's audience feel intellectually superior while sidestepping the actual arguments conservatives present. The other hosts nodded along, reinforcing that familiar echo chamber effect, where agreement is mistaken for truth and repetition becomes proof. No one questioned Joy's framing. No one asked whether her portrayal of conservative views was accurate. No one addressed the enormous assumptions buried within her seemingly simple point. This was the view functioning exactly as intended, a place where progressive ideas were affirmed through repetition rather than challenged with scrutiny. But as Candace Owens later watched this segment while preparing her counterpoint, she examined it with the precision of a surgeon identifying where each cut would go. She didn't see a powerful critique of conservative ignorance. She saw an argument built on shaky foundations, full of unchecked assumptions and misrepresentations of the opposing stance, practically begging for a methodical rebuttal. "Welcome back to today's counterpoint segment," Candace began, her tone lacking Joy's self-satisfaction and instead reflecting the focus of someone ready to analyze an argument piece by piece. "I wanted to talk about the recent Supreme Court abortion case. Honestly, this isn't even about whether you're pro-choice or pro-life. I just do not like bad arguments. And the arguments coming from the left right now are absolutely bonkers." She played Joy as a clip in full, making sure her audience heard exactly what she was responding to. This wasn't a straw man, and it wasn't a pulled out of context. Candace intended to use view hosts' own words to show where their reasoning fell apart. "So let's start with absolutely bonkers Joy. Behar," she said, her emphasis on bonkers signaling that what followed would be thorough and unflinching. The clip played Joy discussing sex, selling everything, from commercials to streaming shows, and concluding that religious conservatives somehow didn't understand what happens when people have sex when it ain't dead. Candace leaned forward, wearing the expression of someone about to explain something carefully to someone who misunderstood something basic. Counterpoint number 1. "Yes, Joy Bahadur. Correct. Sex is everywhere. Our culture is sick. That's a diagnosis. We have an increasingly sick culture here in America." Her shift was immediate and deliberate. Joy had listed the sexualization of culture as an observation, maybe even a complaint, but without claiming any responsibility for it. Candace reframed it as evidence of cultural decay, a decay largely driven by progressive norms. "Religious zealots and people on the right understand that reality," she continued, her tone sharpening. "We understand that when a culture promotes promiscuity, it leads to unfulfilling, unprotected sex. Far from not understanding what happens when you have sex, we understand it perfectly. Children are the consequence. Life is the consequence." This was the first major flip of Joy's framing. Joy claimed conservatives were confused about sexual reality, as though they didn't grasp that sex leads to pregnancy. Candace argued that conservatives understood that fact clearly and that progressives were the ones treating pregnancy as if it were an unfair surprise. "It would seem to me," Candace continued, layering her argument, "that it's the atheist zealots, the ones who normalize sex-soaked commercials. who don't understand what happens when you have unprotected sex. And then when they find out, they say, "Whoops. Good thing I learned in health class that I can just get an abortion to deal with it." This reversal struck directly at Joy's accusation. Conservatives weren't the ones shocked by pregnancy. They were the ones insisting that sex leads to babies and should be taken seriously. Progressives, Candace argued, were promoting consequence-free sex while reacting to pregnancy as though it were an accidental malfunction rather than a predictable biological outcome. But Candace didn't stop at philosophical pushback. She knew dismantling the view's claims required more than rhetoric. It required data and historical context that countered Joy's assumptions. "Did you know, Joy?" "Joy," she said with the tone of someone about to introduce an inconvenient fact, that before federally funded sex education programs in schools, which began in the 1970s, and before Roe v. Wade in 1973, teenage pregnancy rates in this country were declining for 12 straight years. The statistic cut directly into one of the foundational assumptions underlying the progressive narrative. That narrative held that sex education and abortion access were necessary to reduce teenage pregnancy because teens were having sex, regardless, and needed tools to manage the consequences. But if pregnancy rates were already falling before those programs existed, if the trend was improving without them, then what did that imply about their effectiveness or necessity? What did it imply about a culture that saw pregnancy rates rise after these interventions, while still insisting its approach was the only rational one? Candace didn't simply drop the statistic and move on. She explained its significance, how it undercut the premises behind the view's arguments. "Maybe what we on the right understand," she said with complete confidence, "is that there is such a thing as sexually transmitted insanity. The normalization of non-committal sex, pervasive in both our culture and our schools. Cerebus, no one, least of all the young women who end up pregnant and are pressured to make life-altering emotional decisions framed as responsible choices." This reframing was perhaps the most devastating aspect of Candace's counterpoint, what progressives label as reproductive freedom and responsible choice. She framed as cultural pressure pushing young women toward decisions they might not want to make, decisions sold as responsibility, but in reality, often serving as an escape from accountability that could haunt them later. The progressive narrative had always presented abortion as a means of empowering women through choice. Candace argued it could actually disempower them, creating societal pressure to choose abortion and presenting it as the only responsible option when faced with an unplanned pregnancy, while treating carrying a child to term as irresponsible, rather than simply another available choice. "I believe that you and the ladies who sit beside you contribute daily to that toxic culture of lies," Candace concluded, her tone leaving no doubt where she placed the responsibility for the sexualized culture Joy had described. Her argument completely inverted the view's usual framing. They cast themselves as defenders of women's autonomy against religious or patriarchal control, while Candace positioned them as contributors to a culture that harms women, normalizing casual sexual behavior, treating pregnancy like a disease rather than a natural consequence, and pressuring young women into life-altering decisions under the guise of empowerment. But Candace wasn't finished. Having systematically dismantled Joy's argument with logic, data, and historical context, she turned to Whoopi Goldberg, and the contradictions she exposed were even more striking. Not just flawed logic, but a glaring, selective application of principle that highlighted intellectual dishonesty. Whoopi's clip played, her voice rising with that particular indignation reserved for moments when she believed her argument was unassailable. "Do any of you men have eggs, or the possibility of carrying a fetus? How dare you talk about what a fetus wants? You have no idea." The studio audience erupted in applause. It sounded powerful, felt righteous, and carried the familiar sense of settling the debate through moral force. This was the well-worn progressive argument. Men shouldn't have opinions on abortion because they can't get pregnant, claim repeated so often it had achieved the status of unquestionable truth. But Candace saw it differently. She recognized not an unassailable argument, but an obvious trap, a contradiction so blatant that exposing it would be almost effortless. "Well," Candace began, her voice barely containing amusement, I'd love to see that same energy applied when biological men dress as women and claim they can get pregnant because they're trans women. Somehow, I don't think Whoopi would be singing the same tune in that conversation. Her observation was devastating in its simplicity, surgical in precision. Whoopi had just made a biology-based argument. Only people with female reproductive systems at wombs and the capacity for pregnancy can speak meaningfully about pregnancy and fetal development. Yet the View had spent years promoting the opposite position for transgender issues. They argued that biology doesn't determine womanhood, insisting anyone who identifies as a woman is a woman regardless of physical reality, and labeling anyone who suggested otherwise as trans. They promoted the idea that trans women could get pregnant or breastfeed, asserting gender is purely identity, not biology. And now, in defending abortion rights, Whoopi had unknowingly invoked the very biological reality she had dismissed in other contexts. Candace didn't just point this out. Verbally, she brought evidence. Did you know? Candace asked, pulling up documentation. That in 2017, Whoopi Goldberg received a GLAAD Media Award for executive producing Strut, a transgender modeling show. She won for speaking up for trans rights and opposing those who tried to roll them back. She paused, letting the facts sink in before delivering the punchline with perfect timing. Oopsies. This is why I love intersectionality. Here we are in the middle of a culture war, where a bunch of men playing dress-up claim they can give birth and chest feed. And here comes Whoopi Goldberg, so fired up about abortion, accidentally telling the truth. Only women can give birth. Only women have a womb capable of carrying a child. The contradiction was now undeniable and documented with Whoopi's own record. When defending abortion rights, she invoked biological reality. Only women can get pregnant. Only women have wombs. And only women should speak on the issue. Yet, when advocating for transgender activism, she promoted the opposite. That biology didn't matter. That anyone identifying as a woman is a woman, and claiming pregnancy requires female biology was considered hateful bigotry. They say, never get in the way of your enemies when they are making a mistake, Candace observed, clearly savoring the irony. They also say, even a broken clock is right twice a day. I say thanks, Whoopi, for proving that even idiots can grasp basic biology at least when it suits their argument. Her rhetorical takedown was surgical, but it exposed something deeper than mere logical inconsistency. This wasn't simply Whoopi making a careless mistake. It was a pattern of selective principle, applied depending on which progressive cause was at stake. When transgender activism required denying biological reality, the View denied it without hesitation. When defending abortion rights, they invoked biological reality without acknowledging the contradiction. The principle whether biology mattered or not shifted, according to political convenience, not conviction. This was what Candace was truly exposing. Holding a controversial position consistently is one thing, invoking a principle when convenient, and abandoning it when inconvenient, all while pretending to be consistent and casting your opponents as unreasonable, is another. Candace wasn't merely showing that Whoopi was wrong on abortion, she was showing that Whoopi didn't even believe her own arguments. She would cite biology when it supported her point, deny it when it didn't, and accept accolades for promoting ideas directly contradicting her current stance. This kind of intellectual dishonesty, Candace noted, was par for the course on The View. The systematic dismantling wasn't over. Candace had exposed Joy's flawed assumptions about sexual knowledge, revealed Whoopi's glaring contradiction on biology, and now she turned to the broader discussion of abortion and responsibility, forcing an examination of assumptions progressives had never seriously questioned. For the last counterpoint, Candace said, her voice growing more serious, I want to address something crucial in this abortion debate. We live in a culture where men are routinely accused of not stepping up. Consider this. Only 18% of households in America today feature a nuclear family, a married mother and father raising children together. She paused, letting the numbers sink in. 82% of American households were not intact nuclear families. The breakdown of the traditional family wasn't just happening, it was the dominant reality. Father absence, Candace continued, her tone resolute, is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, epidemics we face in this country. It's linked to nearly every social problem we try to solve. Poverty, crime, educational failure, substance abuse. Father absence is the common thread. Her argument went beyond abortion alone. She was connecting the debate to family structure, male responsibility, and the cultural messages we send about fatherhood and commitment. But why are we expecting men to step up, she asked, challenging the audience, when we have women telling them they don't have to? Why should men feel responsible when the message from mainstream culture and media is that beyond sex, they have no role or say in their children's lives? The argument was subtle but devastating. If my body, my choice means fathers have no input into whether a child is born, no obligation to be consulted or informed, why should men take responsibility for children from pregnancies in which they had no voice? Candace pressed the logic to its uncomfortable conclusion. How can one argue a baby is entirely a woman's property in utero, yet demand a 50-50th split of responsibility after birth? She let the contradiction hang, then made it explicit. Can a man stand before a judge at a child support hearing and say, "Your Honor, it was her body, therefore her choice"? The answer is obviously no. During pregnancy, progressive logic grants fathers zero rights or say, but at birth, they suddenly owe 50% of financial, legal, and moral responsibility. Fail, and society condemns them as deadbeat dads. If a man is labeled a deadbeat dad for refusing to participate after birth, Candace said, driving the point home, then the same logic should apply to a woman who refuses responsibility for a child growing inside her. Her final line landed like a verdict. My body, my choice is a pervasive deadbeat mom argument. It does nothing but excuse too many men from stepping up to their most important role as fathers. This final counterpoint may have been the most devastating. It connected abortion to issues even progressive audiences care deeply about. Everyone opposes father absence. Everyone believes men should take responsibility. Everyone condemns deadbeat dads. Candace demonstrated that my body, my choice, the rallying cry of abortion rights activism, actively contributes to the problem, sending a cultural message that fathers don't matter. And that male input on pregnancy is not only unnecessary, but illegitimate. That women should make these decisions entirely on their own, without considering the father's wishes or interests, raised an unavoidable question. If fathers don't matter during pregnancy, why should they matter after birth? If their opinions on whether to have children are irrelevant or even considered an infringement on female autonomy, why should they feel obligated to support children resulting from decisions they had no part in making? The logic was uncomfortable, but it couldn't be ignored. You can't tell men they have no rights during pregnancy and then demand they assume full responsibility afterward. You can't declare fatherhood optional for 9 months and then mandatory for the next 18 years. You can't celebrate female autonomy in deciding whether to carry a pregnancy to term and simultaneously condemn male autonomy in choosing whether to support the resulting child. Either fathers matter, or they don't. Either they are equal partners in the decision to create and raise children, or they aren't. The answer cannot change based on whether the discussion concerns abortion rights or child support obligations. That is in principle it. Es convenient. It's changing the rules to serve whatever outcome suits your interests at the moment. By this point, Candace's counterpoints had systematically dismantled every major argument presented on the View. Joy's claim that conservatives lacked understanding of sexual reality had been flipped to reveal that progressives promote consequence-free sex and then feign surprise at its outcomes. Whoopi's biology-based restriction on male participation in abortion debates had been exposed as inconsistent with her promotion of transgender activism, which denies biological reality whenever convenient. The broader my body, my choice framework had been shown to perpetuate father absence while simultaneously imposing full responsibility on men, a contradiction that advanced female autonomy at the expense of family stability. What made Candace's counterpoints so effective wasn't simply that she disagreed with the positions on The View. Plenty of people disagreed. What made them devastating was the methodical way she exposed the logical flaws, internal contradictions, and unexamined assumptions behind arguments that had been repeated so often they were treated as unquestioned truths in progressive circles. She demonstrated that Joy's argument relied on mischaracterizing conservatives and ignoring data that undermined the narrative. She revealed that Whoopi selectively applied biological reality only when it suited her argument. She showed that the abortion rights framework contributed to the very social problems progressives claim to care about addressing. Most importantly, she illustrated what real engagement with opposing arguments looks like, not dismissing them based on moral superiority or political affiliation, but carefully examining the logic, testing for consistency, exposing contradictions, and showing precisely where and why the reasoning fails. The View had spent years operating in an echo chamber, where nobody challenged its arguments, where audiences applauded emotional appeals without demanding coherence, and where contradictions were ignored because pointing them out was politically inconvenient. Candace Owens represented what happens when those arguments face genuine scrutiny. When someone insists, they make sense rather than merely feel righteous. When contradictions are highlighted rather than ignored. When flawed logic is not excused simply because it is delivered with confidence and moral certainty. Whether one agreed with her conclusions or not, her methodology demonstrated a crucial point. Arguments must withstand scrutiny. If they only hold up in echo chambers where no one challenges them, if they rely on selectively applied principles, if they collapse under careful examination, then perhaps they are not as strong as their proponents believe.